Today's talk is on study design. You've read your paper, you've looked at your paper, you've done your Zotero thing, you've gone through and picked an article, read the abstract, looked at the results, feel that this is important, study. But what you need to do is figure out, well, how good is this study in terms of design? And so that requires you to actually look at the method section. The abstract methods are not sufficient to properly evaluate the study. The thing is, you don't really want to spend your life reading the method section. You want to get in and get out and have specific things to look for, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I've been trying to think about how can we do this efficiently. And I brought to mind a fellow named Michael Pollan, who has made his career on studying diets and what people eat, and the nutritional value of food and what's the best thing to eat. And he came up with a simple 7-word, 8-syllable phrase. It says, "Eat food, not too much, mostly plants." And so eat food, 2 syllables, not too much, 3 syllables, mostly plants, 3 syllables. So I wondered, can I take this structure and apply it to design, something that would help you remember what to look for when you go through a paper and the method section, but not spend a whole lot of time doing it. So I came up with control, no bias, and randomize. So my hope is that you go through your papers and think about those things. And we do this because we want to determine the strength of the evidence. How much can we trust the results? The American Optometric Association guidelines for clinical care, they got these from federal guidelines on this topic. So there are 4 grades. They've given it a grade, D to A, and for grade A studies, they tend to be meta-analyses. These are the systematic reviews of randomized trials. This is really the best place to go if you can find a meta-analysis on your question. That's really a good place to start. They also consider grade 8 single randomized trials with sample sizes that are pretty good. And I've arbitrarily defined a good size, a reasonable size randomized trial, 35 per group, greater than or equal 35 per group, 70 for 2 groups. Propensity analysis. We'll get into that later, but this is kind of an alternative to some observational studies. It's a pseudo-random, and you want your original sample to be greater than 100. We'll talk more about propensity analysis later. So that's the best type of study. A grade B is a smaller randomized trial, less than 35 per group. Also an observational study that is a prospective longitudinal trial. Subjects are followed for at least a year, may have multiple visits, and the sample is greater than 100. Again, sample size is important in these designs because sample size gives us reliable estimates of what we're looking for. More subjects, better likelihood of getting at the real number. A grade C is a retrospective case control studies. This is an inexpensive type of study that you do with medical records, but it has some limitations to it. We'll talk about retrospective case control and longitudinal studies as we go along. Other limitations that bring studies down from A or B to a C, some things are the sample does not reflect the target population of the intervention. For example, if we try to simulate macular degeneration with optometry students, then that's probably not, it's an okay thing to do, but our trust in how it actually impacts macular degeneration patients is somewhat limited. Another problem is a poor reference standard. So you're testing a drug and maybe use placebo when there's a perfectly good standard of care? Why not use what we've already done and see if the new treatment is better or worse than the standard, not better or worse than nothing at all. We want to advance the science. Another limitation is comparisons are not blinded. If a person knows what their whether or not they're in the treatment, or if the doctor knows what the person is getting, then it is not as effective. There's a bias there. And finally, there's the lowest level, the grade D. That's like a cross-sectional study. It's basically a survey. If you read a survey and it's a cross-sectional snapshot of where people are, it's not that it's worthless, but in terms of establishing cause-effect relationships measured at the same time, it's not very useful for that. Case reports, again, it's good to see what people's experiences are, but it's a little hard to generalize that to yourself in your cases. Reviews, position papers, expert opinion, those are all, and by reviews I mean non-systematic reviews of studies other than randomized controlled trials. These are all eminence-based issues rather than evidence-based. And so they're useful in giving you some ideas, but we're not going to really trust those results too much. So let's just kind of summarize control. So a control is a reference. Now, in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, they were searching for the meaning of life. And they finally discovered that it was the number 42. Now, there's no reference. What does that mean? Number 42 can very well be the meaning of life. But since we don't know the context, it's not very helpful to us. So when you are looking at a study, you want to see what are they comparing it to. Is that a fair control? We've already talked about a person who cannot serve as their own control. Person changes over time, so the comparison is not comparable. There's practice effects on outcomes and so forth. Now, there's a design called a crossover design. Now, it's kind of a pseudo-random thing. One group, there's two treatments, let's say. There could be more, but let's say there's two treatments, a treatment A and a treatment B. And a person starts out with treatment A and then goes on to treatment B. And you could kind of think well, that person is serving as their own control when you cross over to a B. That's true, but there's also another group. So if you have two groups, you randomly assign people into one group that starts with A and the other group that starts with B, and then they cross over to the other treatment. Now, this works okay for chronic diseases, like diabetes. If you're testing a particular medication with diabetes, you can do that for a while, then have a washout period, and then start the other drug. But if you were doing something like you have an infected red eye, and then you give them one drug, and then you cross over to a different drug, well, by the time you cross over, the pink eye is probably gone. And so it doesn't really work out too well. Another important consideration for you, and you're a doctor, you have to evaluate this. There's a washout period. First of all, if they just stopped treatment 1 and went into treatment 2, is that appropriate for this? Or do you need time for the original treatment to kind of fade away before you go to the next one? So look at the washout period. And finally, in a crossover trial, make sure that the authors checked for order effects. Does the effect on the outcomes of treatment A or B depend on whether it was either first or second in the order? So if you start with A and the effect of B depends on whether it was A or the difference between A or B depends on which one was first. That's bad. And you have to check that they checked that. Another thing you want to do is make sure the control group is comparable to the treatment. Now, this sounds like a normal thing, but sometimes people try and use historical controls. And they just say, well, this is a group. There was a very famous atropine study for the control of myopia. And when they went to atropine 2, they wanted to know if a lower dose would be good. And so they used the controls from the previous atropine study rather than running those controls again. And it turns out that that was a bad choice. The controls were quite different, and they were misled in the second study. You also want to check that the sample matches your needs. Now, this doesn't really have to do much with the quality, but it does have to do with whether or not this particular paper services your needs. The other thing you want to make sure is that when the authors make a control group, is the dose of the control treatment reasonable? A trick that drug companies use is they use a standard of care, but the dose is too strong and it causes more side effects. Or it's too weak and it's ineffective. The control should be the standard of care, and also a standard of care rather than placebo. You don't want to know if something's better than nothing. You want to know if something's better than what's being done now. So those are some things to consider there. Now, when we talk about designs, we're going to talk about observational studies sometimes. Now, here we kind of cross over from the discussion on bias and control. Observational studies are notorious for their bias, and I want to just talk about two kinds. One is a prospective cohort study, and we noted that we'll give that a grade of B, and the other is a case control study, and we've given that a grade of C. Now, those grades can go down based on other types of limitations, but that's where we start. Prospective studies start out where you've defined all the risk factors and you're keeping score on those over a long period of time. This is a very expensive thing to do because you have to keep track of everybody, and you can lose people along the way. So expense and dropout are big problems in the prospective design, but generally speaking, you bring people into the clinic and you have control over the risk factors that you're studying. Case control, on the other hand, uses your medical records, and that's very cheap. You've got the records already there. And as we move into better medical record systems, these designs are going to be more common and easier to do and inexpensive to do. The problem with them is you're choosing the subject based on whether they have a disease or a control. So you're looking at whether a person has glaucoma or not, and then you're going back in time into the record and seeing if they were taking how early they were assigned to take drops. Now the problem is that you have controls and that did not develop glaucoma, and you have cases that did. And those patients could be very different. I mean, your goal is to say, well, everybody was in this, we matched on age and gender and other things, but maybe you didn't match on other important issues like blood pressure, whatever it could be, exercise, diet, lots of different things. You have no control over that, just what you happen to have kept 5 years ago when you weren't even thinking about the person having glaucoma. So these are the two basic designs. Retrospective, cheap, get an idea of what's going on, but definitely take the results with a grain of salt. Prospective, better, but there develops a bias as people drop out, and you're comparing only those people that or mostly those people that finished the study, you don't know why it was that they dropped out. So bias is systematic error. We don't like bias. We don't want systematic error in our studies. I'll give you an example of systematic error. Take, for example, the Goldman tonometry. That's a device that measures the pressure inside your eye. And it works by tapping on the cornea and determining how stiff it is. And the stiffer it is, the higher the pressure. And that's just known. If your eye is gonna, it's just like you fill a balloon. The balloon is harder if there's more air in it, and there's more pressure against the outer shell. And that's how tonometry works. The problem is that people's corneas are of different thickness. And that thickness, the thicker the cornea, the higher the blood pressure, the stiffer the shell. And that gives you a bias in what you think the intraocular pressure is. You think it's more than it is because of the systematic error from the corneal thickness. So let's talk about some of the main forms of bias. There's selection bias, and particularly this happens in the observational studies, the prospective cohorts, and the case control studies. You need to make sure that the groups are similar in all important aspects, and that's really tough. Information bias is one where has the information been gathered in the same way in both groups. So one thing you do when you're asking them, so surveys are common in this. You give a survey and then you go back and you see people have glaucoma, other people don't have glaucoma, and you ask them to recall various things. When did you start taking drops and other things like that, or whatever it is. And people who have glaucoma, they're very upset about that, and they've been thinking a lot about why me? You know, what is it that I did that put me into this condition? The controls aren't thinking about that. So there's this definite information recall bias going on. Same way when, you know, if you haven't had glaucoma for a long time, then the doctor's not really tracking glaucoma type things. So you don't know what the bias is. Another type of bias is confounding bias. That's kind of like the Goldman example, where there's an extraneous factor out there, this extra factor of corneal thickness. It's kind of getting in the way of this measurement. And you can control that confounding bias by restricting your sample size. Maybe you're looking at only, you break people down, stratify them, break them into ranges where there's people with thick corneas, people that are middle matching. You just see, how does the person control for this bias? A lot of times you'll find in these big studies with observational studies, they have a lot of factors that they're controlling for in a regression format. And finally, there is chance, just plain old chance. There you have a drug or two treatments, and there may not be anything different about them. Their difference, underlying difference, could be absolutely nothing. But the person doing the study is taking samples. He hasn't looked at everybody that ever has or ever will use those treatments. He's taking a sample and he's making an inference. And one of those treatments or drugs is going to come out on top. And it's going to be a little bit better. But if the differences are small or they're not significant, it could simply be a chance effect that the numbers are different, that they're different in a particular way. And this effect is most noticeable when sample size is small. So you have to make sure when you're looking at a study, you make a judgment. Did they look at enough people that the results could be fairly standard? I mean, you have a person in your chair and they have, they have measurements of one thing. Well, you get another person exactly the same age, gender, race, whatever, and their numbers are different. People differ. And how many times or how many people do you need to measure so that you can say, well, the average 10-year-old has this kind of refraction, and the average 5-year-old has this kind of refraction, and where does my subject fall with respect to that? And so chance is a big area of bias. So we have control, no bias, and randomize. So the randomized controlled clinical trial is the gold standard. It eliminates one form of selection bias because people are assigned to groups, they're from the same population. So from a random perspective, everybody is at least balanced. You're not preferring a particular person for a group because you've randomized it. You get rid of all those, when we were talking about like the big trials with lots of regression variables, there's no confounding because you have randomized people from the same, you've taken two people that are a mass group of people that in general, when you select a sufficiently large sample, those groups are going to be the same. That's very important. Again, if your sample size is too small, then the randomization won't completely correct for that selection bias. There will be people that are different just because of the samples. You might get a particular outlier or something. Well, that's true for that kind of confounding, but there is also a selection bias and generalization. While you have to be careful on what is your actual population. When you do a myopia control study, you're not testing the effects of your new super myopic control contact lens across all kids who are going to be myopes. You're randomizing from a group of kids whose parents have agreed for you to be in this study. Now, when you sign up for this study, you say, or the experimenter tells you, we have this great new lens we want to test. Or think cancer treatment. We have this great new cancer drug that we want to test. And we would like for you to be in this study. Oh, by the way, you could be randomized into the control where you don't get the treatment. And oh, by the way, if you're in myopia control, your eye's going to grow over 3 years and there's no turning back. So that type of thing in terms of a randomized controlled study can really impact on this selection bias. So when you're reading your paper, you have to think about these things. Is my sample going to be restricted to people who are willing to be in this kind of study versus others? Another thing about randomized controls, they're registered, clinical trials anyway, are registered with clinicaltrials.gov prior to the study, and the results are required to be reported in the clinical trials database regardless of the outcome. This prevents drug companies and medical device companies from testing their products in numerous universities and cherry picking the ones they liked. In a randomized controlled trial, other sources of bias that can creep in are, for example, the failure to mask. If a person can see, or a doctor can know, or a data analyst can know what the outcome is, then it's there's a potential for some influence to be made there. You're going to be serving as subjects that people study, and you might think, oh, they're looking at this. Well, I like this person. I want them to graduate with their master's. So I'll tell them that this particular condition worked pretty well. And so hopefully that you don't do that. I'm not suggesting that be a strategy, but you have to be careful. Sometimes it's not possible to conceal the conditions. For example, we're doing a study with blue light, and we're looking at the glasses, blue blocking glasses. Well, you can look at the glasses and tell whether they're blocking blue or not. So that's not a mask study. Even though it is randomized, it's not going to make A because there's a failure to mask. The other thing is handling the missing data. So people, as nice as you guys are, sometimes you have a exam the day following the day for your follow-up exam, and you just say, hey, I got to study. I'm sorry, I'm not going to make it. And so or you're going through a question and you just say, I don't know, I'm not going to answer that. So there's missing data. So what do people do? Well, do they just drop that subject? Why do people drop out? Maybe it's because, hey, that lipofuscin study, that light was pretty bright. I don't want to do it again. And it may be because of the nature of their eye. So we can get bias that way. But let's face it, sometimes it's not possible to randomize. I did a study once a few years ago when I was at Children's Hospital. The question was, do seatbelts or car seats increase the risk of trauma, particularly trauma to the spleen? Because if you're a little kid and you're in a seatbelt and there's a sudden stop, you're jammed in to that seatbelt. And so do kids in seatbelts have more spleen injuries than kids without? And you can't randomize parents to strap their kids into seatbelts or not. And furthermore, if you did manage to convince some 10, 15, 20,000 people to be in your study, you would need that many because crashes are fairly rare with kids in the back seat. So you would need a lot of people in your study to get a reasonable sample size to test the effect. So sometimes you just can't randomize. There is a type of design that, most of the time people would look at that seatbelt thing and they would look at all the parameters and control for as much as they could statistically and see if there's a difference. But a better way is to use a propensity match score analysis. I'll give you an example. We did an analysis for a ortho K doctor up in Canada. And he had been collecting data for many years. And originally, he used spherical contact lenses for his ortho K studies or treatments. The original sample was quite a few thousand people, but he did this spherical contact lens. Then he went to a conference with Professor Caroline, who espoused the definite advantages of aspheric contact lenses in ortho K in terms of being able to crank up the add in peripheral fields, which is how myopia control, one of the ways myopia can be controlled, slowed down, to increase add in periphery. And so now he's getting up there in his age, and he says, I made this change. I'd like to know if it did any good. So he had a whole bunch of data, 5-year data, and he had complete baseline data on characteristics of the person's spherical equivalence, iris diameter, um, central corneal thickness, a bunch of measures. And he wanted to know if axial length was different, 5 years, if there was a difference between the two types of lenses. In other words, could he keep axial length shorter with the aspheric lenses? So what we did was we took his baseline measures. We said, okay, these patients had aspheric lenses. These other patients had spheric lenses, and then we ran a regression analysis, and we predicted whether the original baseline variables would predict which group they were in, which type of lens. Now, it's going to predict some people that had aspheric to be aspheric, but it's also going to predict some people to be aspheric who got the spheric lenses. So we look at the probabilities of everyone for each one, and then we match the aspheric group to the spheric group, and we match pairs of individuals based on the probability of them being either aspheric or spheric. And so we get a matched sample. Now, by having that matched or balanced sample, I would say, we have eliminated the confounding from all those initial baseline variables that we had. If we just did a regression analysis, we wouldn't have a matched pair. And so there would still be a bias in the number of people that had one type of initial condition or another. And we end up just throwing away the people that didn't match. They either didn't match because they were outside of overlapping between the characteristics between the two, or that we had just a whole bunch of aspherics that had a probability of 0.7 and only a few to match them, so we threw out the excess aspheric. So we end up with a test of matched patients, and then we have whether they were aspheric or spheric, and then we look to see if there was a difference in the outcome variable of axial length after 5 years. Turned out there was a big difference. Aspheric lenses were much better at this. So that's propensity analysis. Propensity analysis isn't a super common thing that you'll run into very often in your studies, but here's some vision papers that use propensity analysis. This is a much more common practice in the medical literature, and I'm hoping to encourage the use of it in vision literature. It's a clear alternative to the analysis that's used for longitudinal case control studies. You use the same data as those, you just apply this propensity analysis to it, and you get a pseudo-random effect. So, control, no bias, randomize. These are the things that when you're done, you've gone into Google Scholar or something, you've selected your, you put in your PICO search strategy, you've looked at the titles, you've picked out a title that looks good, you've read the abstract, you've looked at the graphs, you believe that this paper is a good one to look at. Now you go to the methods section and you look at control, bias, and randomize. You make sure that there's a control group, that they have at least controlled their bias. No bias is pretty high. And then you favor those studies and give the most weight to those